A widow hits Dusty Creek with 3 hungry boys. Doors slam, storms build. A slick banker points to papers, not pistols, and marks their roof for seizure. That night, the creek runs dry. Someone cut the water. One quiet cattleman offers work, not pity, and lights the school again. He reads the land. He studies the law. At a packed hearing, a single bucket of spring water and a forged seal may flip the town. When power hides behind paper, what would you do? Wind pushed grit along the wagon ruts as Hannah Cole topped the last rise before Dusty Creek. The town sat low against the horizon, a line of roofs and false fronts holding their breath under a bruised sky. Her 3 boys were quiet in the wagon bed, wrapped in an old quilt that smelled of wood smoke and rain long gone. Micah, 12, kept his jaw set like a man. Ben, 8, clutched a tin cup. Little Amos slept with his cheek against the grain sack where Hannah had hidden 2 biscuits and the last of the jerky. The mule flicked an ear at the thunder and kept plodding. They had come 3 days on half rations, following a dry river that used to be their road. Hannah counted everything now: hoofs on boards, breaths between coughs, the thin sound of hope when the church bell rang noon. She had a sister here once, and a brother-in-law who had promised they would figure something. But that was before word spread about her late husband's debts, before friendly faces turned into window curtains and closed doors. Main Street looked busy from a distance, and empty up close. Men who had been talking stepped aside to let the mule pass. Women paused with laundry baskets and stared just past Hannah's shoulder. She sat tall anyway, hands steady on the worn reins, the plain black dress she'd mended so often catching at a loose nail on the seat. Micah stood and scanned the porches like a scout. "Ma," he murmured, "that's Aunt Lydia's place." The house wore new paint. The porch wore fresh chairs. The door wore a bolt. A man opened. It a crack when Hannah knocked. Lydia didn't come. The man, cousin by marriage, if she remembered right, looked at the boys, then over Hannah's shoulder toward the mercantile. "Reckon you heard, Hannah. The note your Tom left ain't settled. Folks get nervous. Best you try the church loft." Hannah felt Micah stiffen. She laid a hand on his shoulder, light and firm. "We won't be trouble," she said. "We're looking for work." "Work's tight," the man said, eyes sliding past her again. "Storm coming." The door closed with a polite finality. On the porch, Ben's eyes shone. "We're still hungry, Ma." "I know," she said, because truth was a kind of bread. She turned the mule toward the church. At the edge of town, a man in a battered hat leaned against a hitch rail and watched her come on. His coat was the kind that had been patched more than replaced. His boots were plain. He tipped his hat once, not as a stranger would, but as if he understood a mile of road by the set of a woman's shoulders. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was steady oak. "Name's Eli Garner. I run cattle north of here. Heard you might be kin to the Whitcombs." "My sister married one," Hannah said. "She's not receiving." He glanced at the sky, where slate clouds stacked like fresh-cut lumber. "You'll get soaked up there by the church. We've an empty foreman's cabin on my south fence line. Tight roof. Stove that draws right. Mrs. Whitcomb keeps house for me. Your aunt by marriage, I'm thinking. She'll sit the place till you get your feet under you." It'd be proper. Hannah's fingers tightened on the reins. "We're not charity." "Neither am I." The corner of his mouth moved. "I need a cook who can stretch a ham bone till it sings, and a hand who can mend shirts without turning sleeves into puzzles. I've also got a schoolhouse that's been idle since last winter. Kids around here get jumpy without lessons. The board might say yes if a teacher stood up. I could pay a fair wage for both, until they do." Bisti studied him, chin lifted. "What if Ma doesn't like your stew pot?" he asked, trying for a smile and failing. "Then I'll eat humble and learn," Eli said. He looked at Hannah. "Work, not pity. You in?" The storm lowered its voice to a distant drum. Hannah thought of the boy's ribs and the way Amos clung to her in sleep. She thought of Tom's ledger with its shadowed columns and of the small slate tucked under the wagon seat, the one Micah used to practice numbers when Tom was still alive and luck hadn't soured. "We'll work," she said, "and we'll pay back any sack of flour you front us." "Fair enough." Eli stepped to the mule's head. "Mrs. Whitcomb will meet us there." The foreman's cabin sat on a gentle rise beyond a stand of cottonwoods, a half-mile from the schoolhouse with its bell rope dangling like a question. Inside, Mrs. Whitcomb had already swept the corners and set a kettle on the stove. She was tall and older than Hannah remembered, with iron-gray hair braided tight. "Child," she said softly, and gathered Amos without asking. "Sit. Boys. Wash. Bread's warm." They ate without talking at first. It was not fine food, but it was enough to put color in Ben's face and make Micah's eyes close for a heartbeat, like someone who had reached shore. After, Hannah helped wash tin plates while Mrs. Whitcomb set a pallet near the stove. Eli fixed a window catch that stuck, then stood aside awkwardly until he found a nail to hammer. "Tomorrow," he said, as the rain started, "we'll ride into town a spell after breakfast. I can speak to the board about the school. Might be they'd take eggs and firewood for tuition if cash is hard. We do that, and those quarters are teachers' quarters proper." Hannah looked at the schoolhouse through the wet glass. The bell rope swayed. She imagined chalk dust and the hum of kids brave enough to laugh. "I can do sums. I can teach reading and how to listen." "I guessed as much." She nodded once. Then yes. Tomorrow, by nightfall, the boys slept. Heavy, warm with stew, and the feeling of a roof that would not leak. Hannah sat at the small table and mended the cuff of Eli's shirt with neat, patient stitches. She set the tiny slate on the shelf by the door. Outside, the rain stitched the world together. Back in town, under an awning, a man in a dark coat watched the water run down Main Street and smiled too thin. Cyrus Vane, banker, tapped a rolled paper against his palm and glanced toward the south fence line, where a small cabin light burned. Why would a banker care about an empty foreman's cabin lit in the rain? The school bell's first ring in months sounded shy, then sure. Hannah stood in the doorway with chalk dust on her knuckles and a steady smile that made skittish kids breathe easier. Little hands set eggs on the desk, 2 buttons in a jar, a sack of kindling by the stove, tuition, the old way when cash ran thin. Micah stacked slates, acting older than 12. Ben hugged the reader he'd been given. Amos pressed his forehead to the warm stovepipe and laughed at nothing, which was the best sound Hannah had heard in weeks. Eli fixed the front hinge so it didn't squeal. "Can't have grammar starting with a groan," he said, and stepped back. He looked different in daytime, same worn hat, same quiet, but you could see how he watched the edges of things, the fence line, the sky, the way a kid sat like he was bracing for bad news. He nodded once at Hannah, then walked toward the creek with a length of willow and the habit of a man who measured before he spoke. By noon, Main Street had fresh news. A square of paper slapped against the foreman's cabin door, tacked high so nobody missed it. Cyrus Vane had signed it in a dark, curling hand. Leanne. Property to be seized for debts of the late Thomas Cole, notice to quit upon demand. He stood there in his neat coat, tapping the nail home as if he were doing a favor for the weather. "Law, Mrs. Whitcomb," he said when she came up the path, flower on her apron. "Nothing." Personal Mrs. Whitcomb wiped her hands on a towel and read the notice twice. "Sir," she said, voice mild as tea, "this cabin sits on the school tract. We have a teacher again. Children inside this minute," Vane smiled without teeth. "Debts don't read primers, ma'am. I'll send men to inspect the place. Best keep your things packed light." Word traveled faster than the storm. By the time Hannah walked the boys home at dusk, eyes followed her from curtains. Eli met them halfway, face set. "Creek's low," he said. "Too low for a day like this. Somebody's cut a headgate upstream." Hannah looked toward the cottonwoods, where the water should have muttered over stones. "Can they do that?" "They can do it," he said, "same as they can tack paper where they please. The question is, can they prove they had the right?" He was out before dawn with Micah at his heels and Ben trotting to keep up. The cold bit through their sleeves. Eli carried a shovel and the willow. He paced the bank with measured strides, counting under his breath, then knelt to finger the silt. "See that?" He lifted wet grit that glittered like ground glass. Fresh cut. Water went somewhere it wasn't heading yesterday. Micah squinted at tracks in the mud. 2 horses, big. One rider drags his left toe. "Good eye," Eli said. Pride warmed the boy more than the sun did. "We keep our heads. Take note, don't accuse what you can't show." Mrs. Whitcomb appeared like a winter saint, cheeks pink, a basket on her arm that smelled of biscuits and bacon fat. "Feed the mind, feed the body," she said briskly, then cut him a look. "What's your plan, Eli?" "A line out every change since yesterday," he said. "Water, footfall, paper on doors. Figure which one they think we won't notice. Hannah had classes that morning and taught like her life depended on it, because in a way it did. She wrote the day's words: duty, neighbor, proof, large and clear. She had the children copy them slow. She held Amos on her hip between lessons and felt the tiny, stubborn beat of his heart. At recess, she stood with Mrs. Whitcomb on the steps while the boys chased one another in the cold. "If you were in Eli's boots," Mrs. Whitcomb murmured, eyes on the low creek, "would you ride to the justice or follow the water first?" She squeezed Hannah's fingers once, then added, almost to the air, "Tell it plain, folks. What would you do?" Back at the bank, Vane spoke to men who wore their hats too low. "Inspection by afternoon," he said softly. "I want that cabin empty. Paper first. The rest will follow." By late day, Eli and the boys found the cut, a new bite in the ditch wall, neat as a fresh seam, water sliding quick into a private run that curled toward Vane's pasture. Eli crouched, said nothing, and watched the flow as if it were a living thing he could learn to read. Micah knelt beside him, anger tight in his small shoulders. "We can't fight the bank." "We don't need to fight," Eli said. "We need to show. The land keeps a record. The law's supposed to, too." He straightened and looked south, where the cabin's lamp would be lit by supper time. "We'll measure again at first light. Then we'll talk to the justice with what we've seen." He picked up the shovel and the willow, slow and sure. "Paper's got teeth," he said, half to himself. "But so does truth when you hold it steady." Can Eli trace the stolen water and set the record straight before that lien turns into an eviction? The cabin's single lamp burned low, throwing long shadows across the table, where Eli spread papers like a gambler laying down cards. Hannah sat opposite, her sewing basket pushed aside, the boys asleep in the loft above. Mrs. Whitcomb dozed in the rocker, though one eye cracked open each time wind rattled the shutters. Eli had borrowed a stack of territorial codes from the justice's shelf. He turned each page with careful fingers, lips moving as he traced lines that most men skipped over. "Listen here," he said at last, tapping a clause. "Teachers' quarters. Any dwelling attached to or adjoining a school parcel kept in service by a duly appointed teacher is exempt from seizure on unrelated debt." Hannah leaned closer. "That's this cabin, and I keep a roll book. Every lesson noted since the day we opened exactly." Eli's voice was quiet, but there was iron in it. "So long as those children walk through your door, no banker can touch this roof without breaking the law he claims to serve." She exhaled, relief tempered by caution. "But Vane has a way of twisting things. That's why we build a record he can't bend. Tomorrow, I'll have Jed Monroe ride out with me. He knows every survey stake hammered in this county before Vane ever showed up in polished boots." Mrs. Whitcomb stirred, her voice dry as kindling. "And don't forget the pond on your north pasture. Your father dug it 20 years ago, Eli. Senior water right beats a shiny new ditch." Eli looked at her with something close to gratitude. "I was thinking the same. If we file that appropriation, Vane's cut head gate will look like theft, not progress." Hannah reached across the table and touched the corner of the statute with her fingertip. "So, the school saves us." "Not just saves," Eli corrected gently. "It protects the land, the water, and your boys. Law says so, if we read it honest." They worked past midnight. Hannah copied attendance records into neat columns. Micah, half awake, crept down to sharpen pencils and asked if he could carry the roll book tomorrow. "So, nobody says we faked it." Eli nodded solemnly, treating the boy's offer like a soldier volunteering for the line. By dawn, frost silvered the window panes. Eli saddled the mule while Hannah wrapped the roll book in oilcloth. Mrs. Whitcomb packed biscuits. Ben and Amos clung to her skirts, sleepy but curious. "Why are we up so early?" Ben asked. "Because the law only remembers what's written first," Eli said. He lifted Micah onto the mule beside him. "And we aim to be first." The ride to town was hushed but urgent. Smoke curled from chimneys, but doors stayed shut. At the clerk's office, Eli laid 3 documents on the counter: a school reinstatement signed by Hannah, an affidavit of teachers' quarters, and a statement of prior appropriation for the old pond. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained cuffs, adjusted his spectacles. "These are in order," he said slowly, "filed this day, before any contest." Eli's jaw eased, just a fraction. "See that it's stamped proper." Outside, the boys kicked their heels against the hitch rail, restless. Hannah stepped into the sunlight with the stamped copies clutched to her chest. For the first time since Dusty Creek, her shoulders loosened. "We're not beggars anymore," she whispered. "We're claimants." But the victory tasted fragile. Across the street, Cyrus Vane leaned against a fresh-painted post, his coat immaculate, his smile thin as paper. He lifted his hat in mock courtesy. "Early birds," he called, voice smooth as oil. "Mind the worms." Eli tipped his hat once but said nothing. He held the documents like a man carrying both shield and burden. That night, back at the cabin, Hannah laid the stamped filings beside the roll book on the shelf above the stove. The fire glowed steady, children drowsed, and for a breath, peace held. But wind pressed against the walls, and somewhere upstream the stolen water still whispered down the wrong channel. Eli watched the flames, eyes narrowed. "We've got the law on paper now," he said quietly. "Question is, will the clerk stand by it when Vane slams his fist?" The room fell silent, the weight of that truth heavy as iron. Will the clerk record their claim in daylight, or will Cyrus Vane close the door before justice can speak? The Sunday picnic spread across the churchyard like a patchwork quilt. Women laid pies on long tables, children chased one another between wagons, and men loosened collars in the soft spring air. Dusty Creek came together on these rare days, setting aside grudges for hymns and contests of spelling and song. Yet under the laughter, a current ran colder. Folks knew Cyrus Vane was tightening his grip, and everyone wondered who might be caught first. Hannah arrived with her boys, carrying a basket of cornbread still warm from the cabin stove. She kept her head high, though she felt eyes measure every step. Micah balanced a reader under his arm, eager for the spelling bee. Ben clutched Amos's hand so tight the younger boy complained, but he didn't let go. Mrs. Whitcomb walked beside Hannah, her presence a quiet shield. Eli Garner joined them from the far end of the yard, his hat shading eyes that never seemed to stop taking measure. He handed Hannah a pie. "Blackberry," he said simply. "Thought you might want it on the table before the boys eat half." She smiled faintly. "You think ahead." "Have to, when the ground's shifting." His gaze swept the crowd. "Best keep ears open today." The hymn began. Voices rose uneven at first, then steadied. Hannah led with clear tones that drew others into harmony. Eli didn't sing, but he stood with head bowed, hands clasped as though weighing the words. Across the yard, Vane clapped too early when the song ended, and those near him followed out of habit more than conviction. Hannah noticed, filed it away. During the spelling bee, Micah spelled integrity, slow and sure, earning a smattering of applause. The pride in his face was brighter than the ribbon he didn't win. Eli chuckled low. "Boys got more backbone than half the men here." Later, at the food tables, blacksmith Abel Rusk leaned close to Eli while filling his plate. "Saw Vane's men in town last week," he muttered. "Bought fresh survey chains from Miller. Brand new, marked in red. Means they're fixin' to move a line." Eli nodded once, voice steady. "Appreciate the word." Meanwhile, Micah slipped near a group of riders boasting by the hitch rail. One, loose with cider, laughed about turning the Garner tap, and how the banker would own the south fence before summer. Micah's fists balled, but he remembered Eli's lesson. Don't accuse what you can't prove. He listened, memorized the words, then hurried back to Hannah. She met Eli under the shade of a cottonwood, her face set. Micah overheard something. "Your water's being stolen deliberate. I figured as much," Eli said. His calm steadied her, though his jaw was hard. "We'll need more than hearsay." But the boy did right. As the sun dipped, Eli excused himself quietly, motioning to Jed Monroe, the old prospector who still carried a surveyor's eye in his bones. They walked past the edge of the crowd to the schoolyard fence. Jed knelt in the dirt and brushed leaves aside until a glint of brass showed through. He dug carefully, pulling up the cap that marked the original plat line. He ran a calloused thumb over the engraving, then nodded. "Still here, right where it's supposed to be. If Vane's chains say different, then he's trying to shift more than water." Eli exhaled slow. "That's proof enough to start." Back at the church, lanterns lit the yard as folks lingered over pie and fiddle tunes. Vane worked the crowd with handshakes and smooth talk, but Hannah noticed fewer eyes met his. People had heard whispers, caught glances, felt the weight of something false. When she gathered her boys for home, Eli walked beside her. "We've got two pieces now," he said low. "A brass cap where it belongs, and riders bragging too loud. Next step's filing it proper." Hannah squeezed Amos's hand. heart pounding with equal parts fear and resolve. Then we won't stop. The night settled around Dusty Creek, quiet but expectant, like the pause before thunder. Is the brass cap truly where the old Platte claims, or will Cyrus Vane's new chains redraw the truth to his liking? At sunup, the frost lay thick, but Eli was already saddled and waiting. Hannah stood at the door with her boys wrapped in coats, the roll book clutched like scripture. Mrs. Whitcomb pressed a hot biscuit into Micah's hand. Eat fast, child. History don't wait. Eli rode hard into town, dusted snow stinging his face. He dismounted at the clerk's office before the first wagon rattled down Main Street. The clerk blinked at him, rubbing sleep from his eyes, but Eli's voice was firm. 3 filings: school reinstatement with attendance, affidavit of teacher's quarters, and statement of prior appropriation for my stock pond. All dated and witnessed proper. The clerk fussed with ink and seal, but when the stamps came down, Eli felt something shift inside him. He tipped his hat. Much obliged. By the time he returned to the cabin, the sky had darkened. Wind howled through the cottonwoods, snow beginning to fall in wild, slanting sheets. Hannah looked up from the stove, worry plain. Storm setting in hard. It came fierce and sudden. By mid-afternoon, the world was white, fences half buried, cattle bawling near the frozen creek. Micah burst through the door, cheeks raw. Calves are bogged down by the ditch. They'll die if we leave 'em. Eli pulled on gloves, calm even with the gale screaming. Rope, lantern, 2 good backs. Let's go. He nodded to Micah. You keep close. Watch the men, not the storm. Snow blinded them as they fought toward the creek. They found 3 calves mired in slush where Vane's men had closed the illegal head gate, choking the flow. Eli waded in, rope biting his shoulders, while Micah shadowed each move, handing loops, bracing his weight like a seasoned hand. Together they dragged the bawling calves onto firmer ground, lungs burning with the effort. Back at the cabin, Hannah and Mrs. Whitcomb had flung open the schoolhouse. Children were already inside, their families seeking shelter. Ben carried buckets of melted snow. Amos toddled between pallets with scraps of bread. Hannah set the blackboard against the draft and used it as a shield to keep warmth in. Lessons keep fear small, she told the children, and began reciting. Times tables while the storm raged. By nightfall, the herd was safe in the lee of the barn, the children asleep in makeshift bunks, and the cabin's fire roared hot enough to dry clothes stiff with ice. Eli sat heavy in a chair, shoulders aching, while Micah leaned against his knee, exhausted but proud. We saved them, Pa. He stopped, eyes wide, realizing what he'd said. Eli only laid a hand on the boy's head and answered softly, We did. Hannah brought broth to the table, her face pale with fatigue but eyes steady. You filed the papers? They're stamped, Eli said, filed first, before any false chains. Mrs. Whitcomb poured coffee with hands that never trembled. Then we've beaten them twice in one day, by chalk and by rope. Outside, the storm screamed, but inside, warmth held like a promise. Eli stared into the flames, his jaw tightening. Vane won't forgive being bested. He'll push harder now. Snow drove against the shutters, rattling them like a warning. The cabin's lamp flickered but held steady. Hannah's fingers brushed the roll book on the shelf, her lifeline in ink and attendance. She whispered a prayer no one heard. The storm passed by morning, leaving drifts like walls across the yard. Children stumbled home through knee-deep snow, laughing, clutching slates that had survived the night. The herd stirred, alive. Yet Eli knew the banker's pride was wounded deeper than the frost. Vane would not rest until the lien was more than paper. What strike will Cyrus Vane make next, now that chalk and rope have undone his plans? Snow melted slow, leaving ruts of mud across the yard and a bite in the air that refused to ease. Eli had just finished checking the stock when 2 riders clattered up the lane. Deputy Murdoch led them, a heavy-set man with a badge that gleamed brighter than his eyes. He swung down stiffly and held out a paper. Eli Garner, you're under arrest for tampering with company works. That cut in the head gate bears your tracks. Eli wiped his hands on his coat, calm as ever. My tracks were there pulling calves, deputy. You know that, not for me to argue, Murdoch said, though his glance flickered. Orders come from the justice, push by Vane. You'll come quiet. Hannah had stepped onto the porch, boys behind her. Deputy, she said, voice sharp with disbelief. You saw our school open. You saw the storm. Eli risked his life to save cattle and children. Murdoch's jaw worked. He looked at Amos peeking from Hannah's skirts, then back at Eli. I'm doing my job. Eli touched Hannah's arm lightly. It's all right. Truth stands longer than lies. He let them take him without fuss, hat in hand. The cell in Dusty Creek's back building was cold, stone sweating with damp. Eli settled on the bench, back straight, hands folded. He didn't waste words. He thought of the cabin, the boys, the schoolhouse bell. That evening, Hannah appeared with Mrs. Whitcomb. She carried a tin pail of broth. He'll take this, she told the deputy, who grudgingly opened the bars long enough for Eli to accept the cup. She also slid folded sheets beneath the door, attendance records, neat and steady in Micah's handwriting. I'll keep your role alive, even here, she said, voice firm though her eyes brimmed. Eli sipped the broth, savoring warmth more than taste. You're stronger than you think, Hannah. That night, fever struck Hannah like a thief. She collapsed against the stove, skin flushed, breath shallow. Mrs. Whitcomb kept the boys moving. Ben fetching snow to melt, Amos tucked tight in quilts, Micah carrying notes back and forth to town. Each day he pushed a scrap beneath Eli's bars. Ma is weak, but she says hold steady. In the fever's grip, Hannah dreamed of her husband Tom, his ledger, the debts, the sharp smell of ink. She heard his voice telling her she'd never outrun what he left behind. She cried out, then woke to Mrs. Whitcomb's cool cloth on her brow. Hush now, child, the older woman whispered. Your fight's not with ghosts. It's here, with us. Eli sat in the dim cell, hat across his knees. He let fever visions of his own rise unbidden, his wife, years gone, and the child buried small on a hill where grass bent in the wind. He pressed palms together, steadying himself on prayer. If there's mercy left, he murmured, let me be of use still. Days blurred, but kindness filled the gaps. Children brought eggs for the school. Neighbors slipped by the cabin with flour and kindling. Even Deputy Murdoch left the cell unlocked one night longer than duty required, sitting outside with a look that wasn't all hard. When Hannah was strong enough to stand, she walked to the cell with Micah steadying her. Her face was pale, but her voice carried. The school kept open. Your herd still breathes. Don't you dare think we'll fold because of chains or sickness. Eli rose, tipping his hat in respect he'd never stopped showing. That's all I needed to hear. But outside, Cyrus Vane stood on the boardwalk, coat perfect, smile thinner than ever. He watched Hannah return to the cabin, then glanced toward the jail with a look that promised more trouble ahead. Can kindness and quiet proof hold the line until daylight brings a fair hearing, or will Vane's paper power crush them first? The schoolhouse smelled of chalk and wood smoke, benches crowded with neighbors who had come to witness what Cyrus Vane called a hearing. Outside, wagons lined the yard, wheels sunk in thawing mud. Eli stood at the front, hat in hand, shoulders straight despite the chill of the stone cell he'd left only an hour earlier. Hannah sat at the desk with the roll book open, her boys close by. She had dressed plainly, but her voice was steady as she greeted the children who had still come for morning lessons. Deputy Murdoch kept watch at the door, looking uneasy, while Vane leaned against the wall in his polished boots. His smile was all charm, his eyes all steel. We're here, he announced, to consider the matter of unlawful occupancy and tampering with rightful waterworks. A murmur spread through the room, neighbors shifting, eyes darting between Eli and Hannah. Mrs. Whitcomb cleared her throat like a church bell. Children first, she said, and nodded to Hannah. So, Hannah rose, chalk in hand, and taught a lesson in front of them all. She wrote sums on the board, called on pupils, corrected gently. Her calm turned the room from a crowd into a classroom, reminding everyone why the building stood in the first place. Then she set the chalk down and faced them squarely. This school is open. These children are taught. The law itself says teachers' quarters stand protected. She placed the roll book on the desk, pages filled with names and dates. Eli stepped forward. From his coat he drew a folded map and a small ledger of water flows he'd measured since the head gate was cut. Here's the school tract as first recorded, he said evenly. And here's the brass cap Jed Monroe found still buried by the fence line. It matches this plat. The foreman's cabin sits square on that parcel, Jed, bent and weathered, shuffled up and held a rubbing for all to see. I struck that mark 30 years ago, and it ain't shifted since. A man with new chains don't erase brass set by the territory. The murmur grew louder, more certain. Still, Vane waved a dismissive hand. Old men and old maps don't settle debts. The creek is my company's to manage, and Garner tampered with it. At that, Eli lifted a small bucket and set it on the desk. He tipped it, and clear water spilled across the floorboards, catching the light. This came from a seep I uncovered pulling calves in the storm. It's fed by the same source as my father's stock pond, filed as prior appropriation, long before Vane's ditch. That means senior right. This water is mine by law and by work. Silence fell, broken only by the drip from the desk. Then Abel Rusk the blacksmith stepped forward, his hammer-rough hands clenched. "I'll say it plain," he growled. "Vane's men bragged about turning Garner's tap. I heard it with my own ears. He stole the water." The justice at the back shifted uncomfortably. His fingers toyed with his spectacles as the weight of the room pressed in. Vane's smile flickered, then steadied. "You all forget who keeps your notes and who holds your deeds," he warned softly. "This town breathes on credit. Without me." But Hannah's voice cut him short. "Without truth, we're all beggars." She lifted the roll book high so every neighbor saw. "These children prove we're not. And the law you bend says this cabin stands." Eli met Vane's gaze, steady as stone. "Your paper can't change water's course, nor move a brass cap buried deep. Justice knows it, if justice dares to speak." The room held its breath, eyes turned toward the justice, waiting to see whether he would side with the banker or with the plain proof laid before him. Will the justice stand with truth and neighbors, or bow to Cyrus Vane's paper power before? The whole town? The schoolhouse had never held so many people. Men lined the walls, women filled benches, children clutched their slates as if history itself were being written. At the front, the justice sat pale and uneasy, weighing papers against the eyes of his neighbors. Cyrus Vane stood near him, polished as ever, lips curled in practiced calm. Eli stood opposite, boots muddy, shoulders square, Hannah at his side with the roll book open. The silence broke when Abel Rusk stepped forward again, voice booming. "I've had enough of lies. I seen the lien Vane posted myself. That seal he used, our clerk never owned it. I checked the stamps. It's forgery." He held up a sheet of paper, edges smudged with blacksmith's hands. "Here's proof." A ripple of shock coursed through the room. The justice leaned forward, frowning. Vane's smile faltered. "Preposterous," he snapped. "A smith doesn't know ink from tar." But then the circuit preacher, gray-bearded and grave, rose from the back row. "I do, and I carry a letter from Harlan Cole, God rest him, written years before his death." He unfolded the brittle parchment. In it he names the school parcel a trust for education, to be held by any Cole widow who teaches there. Hannah Cole is that widow. She fulfills the trust by law and by faith. Gasps filled the schoolhouse. Hannah's hand trembled, but she kept her chin high. Micah stared wide-eyed at the preacher, then at his mother, pride breaking across his face like sunlight. Deputy Murdoch shifted from foot to foot, torn between duty and conscience. At last he stepped forward, red-faced. He faced Vane. "You brought me papers I should have questioned. You pressed me to arrest a man without cause. I won't carry your weight anymore." His voice steadied. "You're under arrest, Cyrus Vane, for forgery and water theft." The room erupted in voices, shocked, relieved, angry. Vane's mask of calm cracked at last. "You fools," he spat. "You live on my credit. Without me, your barns fall. Your land rots." But Mrs. Whitcomb rose, tall and unshaken. "Without truth, barns and land mean nothing. These children will outlive your ledgers, and this town will stand straighter without your hand on its throat." Murdoch took Vane by the arm, this time with no hesitation. The banker's protests rang hollow, swallowed by the voices of neighbors who found their courage in unison. Abel banged the butt of his hammer on the floor. "Enough talk. Let him answer to the court proper." Through it all, Eli remained quiet, steady as bedrock. Only when the noise ebbed did he speak, his voice low but carrying. "This isn't just about me or Hannah or her boys. It's about whether a man's paper outweighs the land and the law. Today you've seen which lasts. The justice, pale but resolute, finally stood. The affidavits stand. The teachers' quarters are protected. The prior appropriation is recognized. The lien is void. This matter will go to circuit court, but until then, the cabin and school remain." Lawful cheers broke loose, filling the rafters. Children clapped though they barely understood, swept up in the release. Hannah's eyes brimmed, her hand finding Eli's for the first time without hesitation. Micah whispered fiercely, "We won, Ma." We truly won. Vane was let out, his polished boots splattered with mud. For once, the town didn't part to let him pass. They watched, silent, until the door closed behind him. The schoolhouse felt lighter, though the weight of what came next lingered. Hannah stood at the desk, touching the roll book like it was both anchor and promise. Eli leaned close, voice meant only for her. If the parcel's held in trust, then it's not just safe, it's a beginning. Her breath caught, the meaning dawning. The land was theirs to guard, not merely to survive on. A future could be built here, stronger than any paper. But what kind of life could rise from that trust? And what choices would they make to shape it together? Winter eased its grip slowly, as though reluctant to let Dusty Creek breathe again. Snowmelt fed the low ground, and from the seep Eli uncovered, a steady trickle of clear water ran into a spring box he built with his own hands. It filled the trough, spilled into a small garden plot, and whispered a promise of continuity. Children brought seeds, neighbors lent tools, and by March the soil smelled alive again. The schoolhouse thrummed with voices. Chalk clicked, slates scraped, and laughter returned where fear once sat. Hannah stood at the blackboard, her voice firm and warm, while Amos traced letters at her knee. Micah led younger pupils in sums, shoulders squared with pride. Ben sharpened quills, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. One afternoon, a wagon rolled up with crates stamped court order. Inside were slates, books, even chalk. Bought from the auction of Cyrus Vane's forfeited assets. Mrs. Whitcomb read the invoice aloud with quiet satisfaction. Looks like he's funding the very lessons he tried to. Silence, neighbors gathered on New Year's Eve, crowding the schoolhouse with lanterns glowing. Abel Rusk hammered 2 rings from horseshoe nails, rough but shining, and handed them over with a grunt. "Not store-bought, but strong," he said. Eli held them in his palm, weighty as any vow. He turned to Hannah, voice low but sure. "I've no fine words, but I'd like to stand beside you. If your boys will have me, I'll be father as best I can." Hannah's eyes filled, her fingers brushing the roll book on the desk. She looked to Micah, who met Eli's gaze and nodded once, fiercely. Ben grinned wide. Amos clapped his small hands. Hannah whispered, steady and tender, "You're home now." The crowd cheered, simple and heartfelt. Neighbors lifted mugs, sang rough hymns, and laughed at the crackle of the stove. Outside, the spring box gurgled. The herd breathed easy in the barn, and for the first time in years, Dusty Creek felt like a place where hope could take root. Later, as the lanterns burned, lo, Eli stood on the porch watching snowflakes drift in the moonlight. Hannah joined him, her hand slipping into his. "We held the line," she said softly. "Not just held it," Eli answered. "We set it right." And in the quiet that followed, the cabin's lamp burned steady, a beacon of work, law, and love stitched together. And maybe that's the lesson Dusty Creek leaves us with. When neighbors stand firm, even paper power can't outweigh plain decency. If you were in that schoolhouse, would you have spoken up or stayed silent? Tell us in the comments, share this story with a friend, and subscribe for the next ride down the trail.